Welcome. Welcome to week 2 of PSHS 6240 here at George Washington University School of Professional Studies, Homeland Security. Just a couple of announcements. Adobe Connect session is 21 January at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's Group 1. We'll be talking about causes of terrorism, and you'll get a lot more guidance next week on that topic in of itself. What I will say is, well, first, let me apologize for some of the confusion with the groups. I had to play a little bit of musical chairs just because some people dropped in and dropped out of the course, so I wanted to make sure the groups were distributed accordingly. So what I'm looking for 21 January and for all the groups when they go, 20 to 25 minute PowerPoint presentation. That leaves us about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. You don't need the whole group. I understand people are in different time zones, etc., and they might be in different commitments. Don't need the whole group there. Just maybe, or definitely someone to brief and redistribute the work accordingly. And then the final thing is this is your grade. You don't have to do a paper for it. Everyone will get the same grade. And please upload the PowerPoint presentation to the Assignment 1 tab. You could all upload the same PowerPoint presentation. So that is Group 1, or that's on 21 January. The paper for the rest of you is due that Sunday, 24 January, at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't start the paper till we go through this week's session, or at least, don't get ahead of yourselves. And I'll be giving a lot more guidance next week on exactly what I'm looking for the paper. I'll give you an example paper to go off of. So just keep in mind, focus on the discussion section this week and the readings, and you'll do fine on the paper in the future. So keep up the effort. I saw a lot of great intro posts. I saw a lot of discussion posts. That's all great. I know a lot of people, this is your first semester back in school, and what happens is, you have a lot of enthusiasm, and then the enthusiasm tends to wane. Please keep up the effort going forward. I want to just kind of keep that enthusiasm for the rest of the course, as well as the rest of the courses you have in this program. So many of the videos are online. I just want to the videos that are assigned, the documentaries that I assign. Right now, you don't need to go rent them, with the exception of this week, the Netflix The 70s. Actually, if anyone could find me a copy of that, that would be great as well. So that's the point this week. You have to kind of search for them online, because links are really moving around on that. The rest are all on YouTube for now, but when Disney Plus or HBO Max comes in, they tend to scoop up all their material from YouTube, so just be cognizant of that going forward. And then finally, current events. You heard my hot take this past week. I'll do one when stuff happens. I don't know what to say of it yet. We have a little bit more information than we did on Wednesday. I think the Capitol Hill police. We can talk about an intelligence failure. I don't know if it was an intelligence failure. Intelligence failures means that you failed to connect the dots. You failed to put together disparate information to arrive at a correct conclusion. There wasn't that much disparate information here. It was pretty obvious. You just have to read. You were pretty obvious something was going to happen at that time, at that place. You had to just read POTUS's Twitter account, and you'd probably have a pretty good idea that not good things would happen. And the mitigation was not that hard, right? So instead of normal hours at the Capitol that you would have, and I've been to Capitol Hill dozens of times, but you would maybe close down the visitor center, or limit the visitor center access. Push the guard posts out a little bit. Prevent the vehicles from coming any closer. Maybe increase the guard force. These are very little mitigation circumstances that I think would have helped, but were not implemented. Even though the intelligence picture, and I put that in quotes, was pretty accurate. So we'll probably get more on that in the days and weeks ahead. But that's just kind of what kind of stood up. And then finally, and I added this to this week's discussion, are the Proud Boys terrorist should that be considered a terrorist group? Um, and I'll send a couple of articles this week that might kind of illuminate that discussion a little bit more in a little bit more detail. So going back to this past week, is terrorism an existential threat? Um, again, has several impacts. It has a psychological impact. Terrorism has a psychological impact that far extends normal death activities. And I don't mean to say that anything else, but terrorism, just by its nature, has a psychological impact. Right now, the latest is like 360,000 people have died of COVID. If 1% of those were killed in a terrorist attack, it would far exceed the impact on our psychology than COVID does. So it does have a far, far more impact than death from disease, death from car accidents, death from all range of other issues. And then the question is that self-inflicted? You saw the videos that were part of the lecture. Do we respond to terrorism because because we cause it? Do we have a TSA? Do we have an intrusive NSA? Do we have all these things because we demand it? Not necessarily because the terrorists force us to, but the terrorists are impacting our mindset. And then we ask, what can impact our way of life? And I always bring up this example. I don't know if I brought it up in the lecture, but if 4 people died on the Beltway here in D.C., where I live, would that prevent you from going to work the next day? Probably not. Even if one person was killed on Monday, if one person was killed on the Beltway on Monday, one person was killed on the Beltway on Tuesday, one person was killed on Wednesday, everyone would still be going to work on Thursday. There'd be no mass disruptions in driving down the Beltway or going to work. Let me give you this other example. Let's say I was a school bus was attacked on Monday. A school bus was attacked on Tuesday. School bus was attacked on Wednesday. How many people would send their kids to school, if we could go to school, on Thursday? Probably the whole country school system would close down. Even though the chances of your son or daughter being actually impacted by that are minuscule, like 0.0001%. They have much more of a chance of choking in the school bus and dying than getting hit by a terrorist attack. But that's kind of an example that impacts our way of life, impacts our psychology far more than any other incident. There's cascading effects as well that I talked about. Going back to the school example, we all know now the cost of having kids at home and not going to school. If you're wealthier, you have to worry about daycare and working with your child at home. If you're not as wealthy, going to school is how you get fed and how you get away from emotional abuse and all those other things that have a negative effect. So the school bus example I just gave you in closing down schools, that affects our way of life. And that's why terrorism is probably a little bit more of an issue than those other policy issues that were brought up in the article. And then finally, we view terrorism as something we can't control. And that is part of it. If you look at the driving example, I can drive slower. I can drive sober. I can not drive, take public transportation. I can buy a car that has airbags and those cool beep beep beeps when you get close to somebody else. So I can mitigate car accidents to myself. I have that power. I can mitigate having a heart attack. I can eat healthy and I can exercise and do all those things. Terrorism, since we don't have control of it because it's seemingly random, we feel a lot more vulnerable. And that's the impact that terrorism has more than any of those other policy issues. So whether you think it's an existential threat or not, I think, and whether you think we self-inflicted or not, terrorism is still going to have a larger impact than any of those policy issues that was discussed in the class. So this is not going to be part of an exam or your paper, but these themes, particularly in the environment of COVID, where a good portion of our country would not wear a mask or do any other mitigation circumstances. But these themes: what is an existential threat? Is terrorism an existential threat? Um, why do we view it a lot more perniciously than COVID? Um, uh, that theme will come up over and over in our class. So week 2 preview. What you're going to go through is the history of terrorism. Terrorism did not start with World War II. It did not start with Al Qaeda and ISIS. Didn't start with the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys. It has a long history. We're going to pick up the story with World War II and terrorism right after World War II. And the one key thing to understand is terrorists have to get a message across. That is their goal, is to use the technology of the day to publicize their message. On Wednesday, the Boogaloo Boys or the Proud Boys got massive media coverage, more so than they would have gotten in any other forum possible. They achieved their goals. And they used the media of the day to achieve their goals. So that's a key point going forward. Just look at a little bit of history. This is the Irgun, which you'll read about, which was the Israeli terror, or was origins the state of Israel, but the group that expelled the British from Palestine. And this is them hanging. It's maybe hard to see, but this is them hanging 2 soldiers here. And the technology they used to get this message out was teletype photos. After World War II, you could send a photo instantaneously. That was a very new technology. It was the YouTube of the day. That's why, the D-Day invasion happened on June 6th. By June 7th or 8th, it was on the front page of every newspaper. You didn't need to mail the photo and send it. You could sell it and send it versus teletype. They knew that they could use those wire services to get their message out with these visuals, and that's what the Irgun did to a great degree of success. This is Black September. You'll see about it in the documentary. This was the attack on the Olympics by Palestinian terrorists targeting Israeli athletes, killing 8 Israeli athletes. This was the technology they used, which was emerging, was 24-hour news coverage. The Olympics were the first 24-hour color TV news coverage of the day, and they knew that they would get massive publicity for their cause. I talked about this in the lecture. The reason we are talking about an Arab-Israeli-Palestinian or Arab-Israeli peace agreement or Arab-Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement now is because of Palestinian terrorism. And a lot of it originates with their ability to get their message across during the 1972 Olympics. So the Palestinians have used media to their advantage. And then finally, ISIS. I think most of us can remember this. Their use of beheadings. The beheadings, you could say, is a brutal tactic, and it certainly is. But it got publicity. It got clicks on YouTube. So in fact, you could say it was irrational, but just like I said in the last week, killing this person, James Foley, and beheading him and killing him in a brutal way was very rational. They knew they would get clicks. They knew they would get internet interest in their website, and they knew they would get publicity. If they just killed him with not on YouTube, no one would have heard of all this. But the fact that they used the media of the day to get their message across was one of the reasons why ISIS was successful at the time. So again, this is kind of history, and when you go through the readings, think how they use their media strategy, how they use the technology of the time to get their message out. And then the readings, again, Hoffman, chapters 1 through 4, the 4 Waves of Terrorism, the 70s documentary. Actually, strike that. One Day in September is not, I don't assign that anymore, so I apologize. That is not a documentary I sign anymore. And then the Vox article on defining terrorism as well. I'm also going to probably see if I can find some articles about, is the Capitol Hill attack, was that terrorism? And then you have my lectures, Terrorism History Part 1, and then what is terrorism, what isn't terrorism, which will guide you into the paper and guide you into the discussion board as well. So if there's any questions or issues, let me know, and I look forward to this week's discussion.